I am live. I am reading today the last extracts of Speaking from the Heart, which is Joan Marshall Grant. It's a book about her, and also there's a lot of her in here. It was edited by Nicola Bennett, Jane Lahr, and Sophia Rossoff. It is Ethics, Reincarnation, and What It Means to Be Human. Joan Grant wrote books about her far memories, and in fact the next book I am going to read aloud is it Land of the Horizon? I'm just trying to think, because I got it for my birthday. Lord of the Horizon was published in 1943. That will be the next one I'm reading, and I am finishing this extract here, which was one of her lectures about psychiatry and past lives, where she just now recounted a drowning in mud. So here we continue with that chapter to end it. About drowning. I had put my okay, so she's talking my memory of drowning in mud is still uncomfortably vivid, but no more vivid than someone with the same degree of recall will find the memory of drowning in mud when a dam collapsed, destroying the village of Fréjus in the south of France only 4 years ago. An experience which is opposite to the incarnation I have just mentioned occurred during Hitler's war. I was able to remove a crippling dread from a man who had lived in that same culture, who had grossly exceeded his official duties when dispatching a once-born to the rain god. It was clearly understood that a sacrificial death must be painless and instantaneous. The customer lay face down on the altar and was dispatched by a blow from a sharp-edged stone club on the nape of the neck. Behind the altar there was a kind of conveyor belt, a trough of polished stone down which the corpse slid, to be received by temple servants whose duty it was to dispose of the dead efficiently. But in the last year of my king's reign, a high priest, who must have been both mad and sadistic, introduced a disgusting variation of this ritual. The belly was slit open and an offering made of the still beating heart. Curiously enough, the gullible population condoned this horrid practice, which they thought conferred additional immortal benefits. So even when the mad priest had been deposed and forced to leave the central province, he continued to receive victims in a small temple in the hills. One of his acolytes went with him, and it was this acolyte whose present personality was a major in a famous British regiment, who asked for my help. He was convinced that if he saw someone wounded in the belly, he would panic, even to the extent of betraying his men by running away. He was a professional soldier and had behaved exceedingly well during the retreat from Dunkirk. His best friend had been blown to pieces so close to him that he had been soaked in blood. This had neither shaken his nerve nor caused any reduction in his illogical terror. He was a fervent Roman Catholic, but neither priests nor psychiatrists had been able to relieve his fear. It was only because he was a valuable officer and had decided to resign his commission and join the ranks of another regiment under an assumed name that his commanding officer sent him to me. He was by no means an enthusiastic guest, for he considered that anyone who claimed to have far memory was either a charlatan or a witch. However, I was fortunate enough to be able to see the cause of his anxiety, and even more fortunately, he was able spontaneously to remember it too. He realized that he had been waiting for the pain and terror he had inflicted to bounce back on him, and that the reason why, since early childhood, he had been terrified of seeing a wound similar to those he had so often inflicted was because he thought the sight would make him fully conscious of his inevitable doom. I had to work fast, for he had only 48 hours leave. But I was able to convince him that although his earlier behavior had been sinful, it was also a sin he no longer wished to repeat, and so it had been most gently forgiven. Before he left, for no logical reason, I gave him a packet of sulfonamide, the only antibiotic I had, and a threaded surgical needle in a sterilized tube. He had already told me that he carried morphia when on active service. I met him a year later and so learned that this amateur equipment had been useful. During the Battle of Cassino, he had been inspecting an outpost when it was wiped out, the sole survivor being his sergeant and himself. He was not even concussed, but his sergeant was wounded in exactly the manner he had so long feared to see. He knew there was no hope of immediate medical assistance. As it transpired, they were cut off from the rest of the battalion for 24 hours. So he put the extruding bowel back into the abdomen, having first waited for the morphia to take effect, then sprinkled the sulfonamide into the wound and sewed it up. The sergeant made an uninterrupted recovery. I have told this story not as an example of the role which farm memory can sometimes play in psychiatry, but to show how careful one must be not to go beyond the reference frame of one's evidence. I consider, and I think justly, that the efficacy of the cure had proved that the recall had been accurate. A recall that is off the beam seldom, if ever, has any lasting result, but I had no evidence whatsoever that the cause of the neurosis had taken place in Atlantis. I now know that the reason why I allowed my intellect to fob me off with this vague locale was to prevent my intellect nagging at my intuition to find out when and where. For this nagging would have drawn off energy from the purpose on which it was engaged, a purpose for which my intuition needed every available unit of energy. If a belief in a lost continent was now being used only as a muzzle for an over-inquisitive intellect, a muzzle which would stop intellect harassing the intuition and instinct of people who are trying to do the already sufficiently difficult job of extrasensory perception, I would not have made so controversial a subject a primary theme of my final lecture, but to have failed to state unequivocally that I am convinced that Atlantis never existed would have been to betray my own integrity. We must each play our part in the renaissance of sanity, which will arise only when reincarnation, with its recognition of our individual responsibility for our character and our actions, is again accepted as a foundation of our ethics. But we cannot play our part unless we have the courage to admit our frailties, our fear of ridicule, our evasions, which have led us to build our slender hoard of evidence into the ephemeral bastion of cloud cuckooland. The cuckoo has no nest of its own. It lays its eggs in the nest of other birds. Atlantis has no past of its own, so it lays the burden of its mythical doom on the future. To believe in a myth is to weaken our hold on truth, weaken it until we are vulnerable to the lazy allure of prophecy. For to believe in prophecy, to believe that the future is immutable, instead of knowing that it is the creation of our free will, is to deny and to desecrate the shining reality of reincarnation. So this is an intensely interesting book for me anyway, and I can highly recommend it for you to purchase it. It has been praised, and I cannot wait to go back into Old Egypt to read Lord of the Horizon.